I am so pleased to introduce our next speaker, Pulitzer Prize-winning best-selling author and presidential historian, Jon Meacham. Jon is always in high demand for his calm, smart, and reasonable voice. In these days, you can certainly understand why. Jon's prolific work gives us context to history, allowing us to draw important lessons and the reassurance that we can navigate our way forward. His latest book about the extraordinary and inspiring life of Congressman John Lewis is just one powerful example. Jon has a long list of striking accomplishments. As a visiting professor at his alma mater, the University of the South, and at Vanderbilt University, Jon shares his insights with students seeking knowledge. As a commentator for national news programs, Jon provides historical context for some of today's most consequential events. As a historian, Jon delivers new ways to consider our past in order to prepare us for our future. At Wiley, for all of our 200-plus years, we have believed that advancing knowledge and inspiring the exchange of ideas are essential to advancing the human condition. This is true now more than ever, as we face great challenge and even greater opportunity. Today, Jon will talk about the lessons we can learn from epic races and pivotal elections that have shaped our history. A timely topic, to be sure. Jon, thank you for continuing to make it all make sense, for me and for the betterment of our nation and our global community. The screen is yours.
Thank you, Ryan. I appreciate it. I must say, being calm, smart, and reasonable in this climate in America is like being the best restaurant in a hospital. You want to win, but it's not that hard. But I'll take it, and I'm hugely grateful to you. And we had a great roundtable earlier, and so I'm delighted to be with a formidable group of people, all of whom are thinking about how to be illuminating as opposed to divisive in an intrinsic way. I want to take our time to talk about a couple of important presidential elections and a couple of ways to think about the choices we make. American presidential campaigns are really kind of an MRI for our national hopes and fears at any given moment. Every 4 years, we undergo this. Some people think it's too often. I think it's probably, the founders probably got this part right. It's a good gut check on our hearts and minds. It's a good way to see whether we are moving in a direction that enough of us want to move in, and to check whether our wants align with our sense of justice and should. So what we want, where we want to go is not always where we should go. And the greatest candidates, the greatest moments where electors have responded to those candidates have been those that have not comforted and played to our pre-existing assumptions, but those that have challenged those assumptions and have urged us actually to get a little uncomfortable, as John Lewis would say, get in a little good trouble as we move toward a more perfect union. We are speaking, obviously, fewer than 24 hours after what will be a memorable presidential debate. I thought it was a low moment, honestly, in the history of the American presidency, given the incumbent's behavior. But I think everybody probably knows what they think about that, so I don't want to waste your time talking specifically about the moment, but try to put the moment in context. And so I want to, I know this feels agitating. I know it feels dispiriting. I had that experience last night. Brian and I were talking with my children. I was watching with my 12-year-old and my 16-year-old. And I had this sinking feeling as the debate went on that they were wondering why on earth their father would spend their time talking to and thinking about these people, at least the one on the left side of the screen last night. But context is all, right? So let's go back 50 years, just for a frame for this. 52 years ago, if we had been talking on the last day of September 1968, what would have been going on in America? The year had begun with Tet, the North Vietnamese offensive. that drove Lyndon Johnson, who had won the largest electoral landslide in American history only 3 years before, into even deeper unpopularity. Eugene McCarthy, the senator from Minnesota, challenged Lyndon Johnson in the New Hampshire primary, surprised him with a strong performance. That led Robert Kennedy to announce his presidential candidacy in the Senate caucus room, where his brother had announced his candidacy 8 years before, on March 16th, so pretty late in the game. On March 30th, March 31st, 1968, Sunday, Lyndon Johnson withdrew from the presidential race. There was no more political man who ever breathed than Lyndon Johnson, but he pulls out, which is a cataclysmic political event. That same Sunday, Martin Luther King had been at Washington National Cathedral delivering a Sunday sermon. In that sermon, he said, "We are bound in a mutual garment of destiny. I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be, and you can never be what you ought to be until I am what I ought to be. That's the way God's universe is made. That's the way it is structured." 4 days later, Dr. King would be shot to death outside room 306 of the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee. That night, Robert Kennedy in Indianapolis gives a extemporaneous eulogy in the inner city there, talking about how the work of the human condition is not to avoid pain, but to find out and discover what we can do with that pain, which is inevitable in a frail, fallen, and fallible world. The country goes up in flames that weekend in riots after Dr. King's assassination. 6 weeks after that, Robert Kennedy would be shot to death in Los Angeles. 6 weeks after that, the Democratic National Convention would descend into chaos and violence. And on Election Day 1968, 52 years ago, Richard Nixon would win 41% of the vote. Hubert Humphrey, a Democratic vice president, sort of seen as a conventional liberal, would win 40% of the vote. And George Corley Wallace of Alabama, running on an explicitly segregationist platform 52 years ago, won 13.5% of the popular vote and carried 5 states in the Electoral College. There were fears throughout the year that Wallace's performance on a third-party ticket on a Jim Crow platform, 52 years ago used to seem like a long time to me until I hit that age, that his performance would throw the election into the House of Representatives, which is a scenario that I think all of us should be reading up on for this year. So that's not a great year, right? There was a sense that everything was coming unglued. The issues were law and order. The issues were the future and safety of suburbs. The issue was racial reconciliation and racial reckoning in the context of a consuming cultural crisis. In that case, it was Vietnam. 46 Americans died every day in Vietnam on average in 1968. Not wounded, not captured, killed, 46 a day. The pandemic's toll is even worse, but it's not a dissimilar moment. And the country came to that last final decision to make in the first week of November, and they narrowly chose Richard Nixon, a figure who had played to the racial anxieties in the country, but who largely governed as a fairly conventional Republican and challenged the assumptions of his base by opening China. The more interesting number to me about 1968 is that if you add George Wallace's numbers to Richard Nixon's numbers, you got 55% of America voting largely against the implications and reality of the civil rights movement that had reached a high watermark in 1964 and 1965. I do not lay this story out to say, because it's happened before and we're all still here, it's going to be fine. Quite the opposite. I lay this story out to remind us that the forces that are shaping this presidential campaign in our own time are perennial. And no single election, no single piece of legislation is somehow going to make the forces of racism, nativism, extremism, isolationism go away. At our best, we have made those forces ebb as opposed to flow. Right now, they are flowing like a mighty stream. And I think the work of this election is to find a way in the soul of the country, if you will, the essence of the country, to find a way for what Lincoln called our better angels to win a temporary victory over our worst instincts. Because fundamentally, that's what America does. No victory is ever final. No progress is ever beyond being revisited. It is a perpetual task before us to create a more perfect and a more just union. And no great movement in American life has ever taken place or been successful, even in the short term, without broad public support that often began with the powerless attracting the attention of the powerful. People like me spend a lot of time focused on the presidency. And I make no apology for that. So did Shakespeare. That's where our similarities end, but that's all right. But the president is, in many ways, a reflection of who we are, as much as a maker of who we are. Joe Biden and Donald Trump are on the ballot next month. We all are. And I want to talk a little bit about a couple of presidential races that I think shed some light on how to think about the choices we make for the people we send to the pinnacle of power. And they really fall into, these choices really fall into two categories. We need to judge where a candidate fits in a broad consensus, which I'll explain. And then, and this is not an uncontroversial assertion, the presidency is almost all about character. And yes, I know there are structural forces. Yes, I know about the 18th century constitutional system that limits action. I understand all that. But history tells us, experience tells us that the person sitting behind that desk makes history and affects millions upon millions of lives because of the character they bring to that desk. Heraclitus said that character is destiny, and destiny in Greek could also be translated as fate. So our public character is our fate, and the president's character shapes our fate. And that may begin to feel as though it becomes remote and as if we're ceding power. But remember, in a republic, we make the context for that character possible. Your character and my character matter enormously in a republic because we are the sum of our parts. Our dispositions of heart and mind, my appetites and ambitions, your appetites and ambitions, all matter here because we have to have a consensus in which that character, the character of the leader and the character of the people, create this dialectic that shapes our public life. So where does a candidate fit into the consensus? My sense of the one way to think about American politics and life from 1933 to 2017 is this, that there was a consensus in the country, and it was shaped by a figurative conversation between Franklin Roosevelt and Ronald Reagan. Think about this for a second. That was the context. That was the football field on which every president from 1933 until 2017 governed. They were, one was on sort of the, if you're a football fan, on the 20-yard line over here, and the other was on the 20-yard line over here, defined by their responses to two fundamental questions. One was the relative role of the state in the marketplace, and the other was the relative projection of force against commonly agreed upon foes and rivals. Every president, from FDR to Barack Obama, basically governed on that field. I have blown this theory, by the way, privately past President Clinton, President Bush, 43, and President Obama, and they've all agreed that that was a coherent conversation. There were ferocious disputes. There were existential disputes through those years, unquestionably. 1964, Barry Goldwater versus Lyndon Johnson would have shifted that conversation, but it would have shifted it on that field. 1972, Richard Nixon and George McGovern would have shifted the conversation, but would have shifted it on that field. 1980, Ronald Reagan and Jimmy Carter would have shifted that conversation, but would have shifted it on that field. Barack Obama, John McCain in 2008 shifted that conversation, but did so on that field. Where we are now is not a sequential play on that field. There's a kind of incoherence to the incumbent's style of governance that has upset that consensus in fundamental ways. So one question you have to ask when you assess a candidate, and this was true of FDR and Landon in 36, and FDR and Wilkie in 40, FDR and Dewey in 44, Truman and Dewey and Thurman and Henry Wallace in 48, Eisenhower and Stevenson, 52 and 56, Kennedy and Nixon in 60, all the way forward, is does that person fit on that field? Now, you may want to change the conversation. You may think that consensus should be changed. That's fine. But be aware that you are pushing against almost 100 years of history. And that can happen. American history has changed, but it has taken longer than one election cycle to do it. So I think the first question you have to ask is, where does this person fit? And if you want them to fit on that field, check. If you don't want them to fit, be aware of where they're going to go, because it's going to be rough and dissonant as you get there. It's not to say there can't be radical reform. Of course, there can, and in many ways should be. But radical reform often requires not simply a radical person open to that radical reform, but the creation of public opinion to make that work possible. That's the dialectic between us and him or her at the top. So the place in the consensus is one issue. And the other is character. And just to run through this, in 1960, Arthur Schlesinger Jr., marvelous historian, who's a friend of mine, he died the way we should all die, which was on his second martini in a New York steakhouse. That's where I want to go. He had to write a book called Kennedy and Nixon, Does It Make Any Difference? Because the conventional wisdom of the time was that Kennedy and Nixon were simply cut from the same managerial cloth. They were these young baby boomer strivers, not baby boomer, but young World War II strivers who were essentially the same person. Now, we look back on that and think John Kennedy and Richard Nixon were the same. Someone had to write a book saying that would there be any difference between them? But that also shows you that what we see in real time is not always what we understand and appreciate in retrospect. And here's to me, the most revealing moment of the 1960 campaign in terms of the character that President Kennedy ultimately brought to the office. In October of 1960, October 16th, 1960, Martin Luther King was arrested for attempting to desegregate the Rich's department store in Atlanta. He was denied bail by the judge and sent to a state penitentiary in rural Georgia. Black folks didn't always come out of state penitentiaries in rural southern states alive. Coretta Scott King was pregnant. She was panicked for her husband's safety. She anxiously reached out to the Kennedy campaign looking for help and was not at all sure how that call would be received, because Jack Kennedy and Robert Kennedy were running a presidential campaign for a Democratic Party that in those days was divided between Northern liberals and Southern segregationists. It was one of the odder forces in political life. And Kennedy had no interest in being seen as soft or liberal on racial issues because he had to keep his southern flank together. His character, though, fundamentally was open to the possibility of great historic action. And it was presented to him, would he call Mrs. King? Now, Dr. King's father, called Daddy King, had endorsed Richard Nixon. Black voters were still about 60 to 70% who were actually enfranchised, were on the Republican side still. It was just about beginning to shift because of this episode. Kennedy said, out of a basic human empathy and a sense that history was calling white politicians to be open to the plight of Black Americans. In 1960, that shouldn't have been a remarkable thing, but it was. And so he said, sure, get her on the phone. He made the phone call. He didn't do anything. He just called Mrs. King and said, I know this is a terrible time. It electrified the Black community. Daddy King shifted his endorsement. Dr. King was grateful. He would later be wiretapped by the Kennedy administration, showing you the complexity of these things. But in an election that was decided, as that one was, by 100,000 votes, that call began to shift, and it was the most important shift in modern American politics, the loyalty of Black voters, by and large, from the Republicans to the Democrats. And it opened Kennedy's eyes to the possibilities of genuine reform. And so when it came time for him to respond to the burgeoning civil rights movement, he could be slow. He could call for patience when he had never had his rights curtailed. But that phone call lived in his memory, that by doing the right thing, it had also benefited him politically. You saw there his character that was ultimately fully manifested on June 11th, 1963, when on the same day that George Wallace stood in the schoolhouse door in Tuscaloosa, President Kennedy proposed a Civil Rights Act that evening. 2 hours later, Medgar Evers, the field secretary of the NAACP, would be shot to death in Jackson, Mississippi. But that civil rights bill, presented in June of 1963, was what became the 1964 Civil Rights Act. So shifting to President Johnson, Lyndon Johnson, from a segregated state, November 22nd, 1963, President Kennedy is killed in Dallas. That night, back in Washington, LBJ, now the President of the United States, amid tragedy and gloom, potential Cold War standoffs, always a reality, always a possibility, is lying in bed dictating things to do, people to call, funeral arrangements. And he says that night, I'm going to pass President Kennedy's Civil Rights Bill, and I'm not going to change a comma. And his political advisors, the reason they'd been in Texas anyway, was because there was a split in the Texas Democratic Party between liberals and the segregationists. They were afraid of losing the Senate seat down there, the second Senate seat in Texas, to a young guy from Houston named George Herbert Walker Bush, who was running for the Senate in 1964. They'd been trying to put the party back together. They were worried about Barry Goldwater and his appeal to conservatives who were reacting against the civil rights movement in the South. His advisor said, why can't we wait? Johnson understood, as he put it, what the hell is the presidency for, if not to do the big things that other men might not? And in that bit of his character, his need, his drive to do big things, that personal ambition intersected with the cries of the powerless in America to pass the Civil Rights Act in 64, to pass the Voting Rights Act in 1965, because of the immense work of the innumerable souls of the Black freedom movement who had made Lyndon Johnson's reform possible. Character was destiny. And in 1964, the country affirmed what Johnson was doing by an immense margin, 62%, almost unthinkable today. He buried Goldwater in 1964. And that was part of the consensus, and that was part of character. The lesson there is when people went to the polls in 1964, if they had those two things in mind, having those two things in mind, they chose Lyndon Johnson. That was a high watermark of American liberalism. In October 1964, the Pew Trust found that 77% of Americans trusted the federal government to do the right thing some or most of the time. 77%, never higher. That number now is 17%, and I think that's a little high. So from that moment, from that high watermark, we have watched trust in government fall. Why? Because of Vietnam, because of Watergate, because the public sector, with this, we gave this, it's an immense amount of confidence, immense amount of power, and it seems to have produced fewer results than people want. And so the field has moved closer to that figurative position of President Reagan. But even President Reagan, again, and like Lyndon Johnson, who challenged his Southern segregationist base by saying that he was going to pass that bill without changing a comma, Ronald Reagan, who was seen as this Cold War, Reagan said actually in 1980 that voters thought he was a combination of the Mad Bomber and Ebenezer Scrooge. But what does he do with the Soviet Union? He's an old union negotiator. Reagan was the head of the Screen Actors Guild. He knew that if you asked for 100, you'd settle for 50. He comes into office. He says that the Soviet Union is an evil empire. He says they reserve unto themselves the right to lie and to cheat and to steal, and they seek world domination. And by May 1988, he's literally playing with a baby in Red Square. And in his farewell address, showing an essential character, he said that America had to be a shining city for, as he put it, all the pilgrims from all the lost places who are hurtling through the darkness toward home. Given where the Republican Party is today, that's like quoting the Peloponnesian Wars. Character and consensus heading into the 2016 election fell victim to a populist revolt that really grew out of anxiety about trade, anxiety about globalization, anxiety about race. A lot of folks who look like me, I'm a boringly heterosexual white Southern male Episcopalian. Things tend to work out for me in this country. But a lot of people who look like me believe that the country is fundamentally changing in ways that will leave people like me in a minority for the first time. And so they chose someone with a character who fed those anxieties as opposed to tried to push us forward, and took that consensus that we had lived with from 1933 forward and broke it up. What's on the ballot now in the next 5 weeks is a restoration of that conversation that was familiar. It was not necessarily commensurate with all of our problems, but it was a familiar vernacular and the character of the two men we saw last night. If history's any guide, then making a judgment based on having a coherent conversation and the character of someone whom you would trust with a fundamental task will be on that ballot in November. Thank you all very much.